get started here. So thanks everyone for coming to our, I believe it's our third talk for the spring and the ACME seminar series, remote. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Ben Frandsen, who's a professor at Brigham Young University right now. He's been there, I guess, about 3.5 years now. 3.5, yeah. He actually already has significant funding, the DOE Early Career Award, working on neutrons. Is it also X-rays and muons still, or just neutrons?
Mostly neutrons, but also some X-rays and muons. Yeah.
Okay, great. All the particles.
Right.
I think a lot of people in the room have seen the PDF pair distribution function stuff before. Ben is an expert at this stuff. He's been doing it, as far as I know, his entire career. That's certainly, for me, that's how I started learning some of the power of it, was seeing some of what Ben had done a few years ago. He did his PhD with Simon Billinge. Is it Billinge or Billinga?
Billinge, yeah.
Okay, good. I've always thought it was Billinge. Just, you never want to say their name wrong. And Tomo Uemura on PDF stuff. So Simon Billinge is famous for developing a lot of the technique behind it. He did his postdoc in the Bergeno group at UC Berkeley, another sort of famous scattering group. So he's done a lot of stuff with PDF. He's still doing it at BYU, but he's doing new things, taking a new direction. So I'm pretty excited to see what he's going to show us today. So I'll let you take it from here, Ben. And,
all right. Great. Thank you very much for the introduction, Jared, and for the invitation, Adam, to speak as part of this seminar series. I think it's a great idea. And I was just commenting before we started what an impressive lineup of speakers you have, not including me, but including the others. I'm really happy to be speaking to you today. As Jared mentioned, I'm coming to you from Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. Let me turn on the pointer here. So here's a picture of campus. This is the physics building where I'm working right now. But the work that I'm going to show you today actually started back when I was a PhD student at Columbia University in New York. And then a good chunk of what I'll show you is a few years old now, and I did while I was a postdoc at Berkeley, as Jared mentioned. And yet, these three places where I've worked, I've actually done basically none of my actual experiments at these locations. Instead, I've been going to particle accelerators like the spallation neutron source at Oak Ridge National Lab, or the NSLS-2, National Synchrotron Light Source 2 at Brookhaven National Lab, where I use particle beams, specifically neutrons and X-rays and muons, to study the structure and magnetism of interesting materials. So I feel fortunate to be able to work at these incredible facilities and collect data and learn interesting and useful information about technologically relevant materials at these facilities. So let me give a quick outline of my talk. I'm going to tell you two short stories today about local atomic and magnetic structure and how that's important for understanding the properties of materials. The first story is about ubiquitous short-range pneumatic distortions in iron-based superconductors. And this is a couple years old now. Here are some papers that you can see they're a few years old. There's probably one or two more papers that I need to write on this topic before I really wrap it up. But this was a big part of what I did during my postdoc, and have continued to some extent in my current position. That's the first story. The second story that I'll tell you is visualizing short-range antiferromagnetic correlations in manganese telluride. This is a magnetically enhanced thermoelectric material. And this work has been written up in a paper, which is currently under review. So that's what I'll tell you about. But I'm actually going to start by describing what I mean by local structure, since that may not be immediately obvious. And along the way, I'm going to introduce you to the PDF method, pair distribution function, as well as a variant of that called magnetic PDF. And my hope is that through this talk, if you learn something interesting about iron-based superconductors or manganese telluride, that's great. But the take-home message that I really hope you might actually remember is that if we want to understand globally, we have to look locally. All right. If we want to understand the global properties of materials, which are, usually the ones that are useful for technologies or who knows what, we very often need to start by looking at the local structure on local length scales. So that's the take-home message that I hope I can convince you of throughout the course of this talk. So let's start with what I mean by local structure. And let's start with what I mean by structure. So very generally speaking, the structure of a material can be described as the arrangement of its constituent parts. And this could refer to a number of different things. It could refer to atomic structure. Then we're talking about how the atoms are arranged. That's usually what we think about when we say the structure of a material. But I am also using this term structure to refer to, for example, magnetic structure. All right. If our atoms have unpaired electrons and we have magnetic moments associated with the atoms, then how are those magnetic moments arranged? How are they oriented relative to each other? That's what I mean by magnetic structure. And there are other aspects of structure that we could consider as well. I'm just going to focus on these two for the talk today. So that's what I mean by structure. What do I mean by local structure? Well, I mean, we zoom in and we look at the structure on short length scales, on length scales roughly equal to, a few interatomic spacings. All right. So we're looking at a few neighbors, or maybe a few nanometers. Okay. That's what I mean by local structure. And I want to contrast that with what I mean by average structure, which is when you look at a much larger length scale. And again, the view I'm showing here isn't really the average structure yet, but imagine, thousands of unit cells. Then that's basically what I mean by average structure. And you can imagine kind of averaging over all of that region and collapsing it down to a single kind of equivalent unit cell, for example, if it's roughly a crystalline material, and that would be the average structure. Okay, so it's just a difference of length scale that we're talking about here. And the key point is the local structure is not always equal to the average structure. All right. So if you do this exercise, if you take, a large volume of your sample and then you calculate the average structure from that and compress it down to, a single unit cell, that may not be a good representation of what you would see if you actually looked at small individual regions within your larger volume of your sample and examined the structure on those local length scales. Okay, so local structure is not always equal to the average structure. And the differences can sometimes be very important for the properties of the materials. There's an example I like to share to demonstrate this, and credit to my PhD advisor, Simon Billings, for this example. This is a video of the Shibuya intersection in Tokyo. This is branded as the world's busiest pedestrian intersection. And I'm just going to play this video here. Let's see. Take off the, okay. For some reason, oh, there we go. Okay, so let me play this video. So the light turns green. Sorry for that noise. That's just the ambient street noise. Okay, so we've got pedestrians crossing, hundreds of people crossing. And from where we're looking, there doesn't appear to be any definite pattern for how these masses of people are moving through each other. Okay, so no particular structure or order to this. Okay, but if we look at the same thing from a different perspective, maybe we'll notice something. Okay, so the light turns green. We've got these groups of people moving past each other. I want you to look and see if you can detect any local ordering or local structure that shows up in these groups of people. Okay. All right. So if you look, you may see stripes. You see a stripe of people moving this way, a stripe of people moving this way. All right. Another pair of counterpropagating stripes here and here. Okay. So there is this emergence of some type of pattern or order on a kind of local length scale. This is not a well-defined, people are not in rigid lines. There's not any kind of long range order over this whole intersection, but locally there appears to be the formation of these stripes of counter-propagating pedestrians. And let's look one more time with a local probe. This is a handheld camera, okay? And what you'll notice is there's a very strong local correlation between the person holding the camera and the person with this handbag right here, okay? So there's a very strong local correlation there. So that's an example of local structure being important for the properties of a system. In this case, the system being, hundreds of pedestrians, but that local order, people kind of spontaneously forming into these rough patterns of stripes, moving in the same direction as the people directly in front of them, opposite direction to the people on either side of them. That is important for understanding the overall properties of this system, how people get from one side of the intersection to the other. Okay, so there's my real world example of local order, local structure forming in systems. Let me give a second example that's maybe a little more familiar or a little closer to what we typically do research on. Let's imagine an alloy. Okay, this alloy here, this is a pretend alloy consisting of 50% atoms that are black atoms, 50% yellow atoms, okay? And in this version of the alloy, the atoms are completely random, okay? It's completely random occupancy. So there's no clearly defined local structure. If you want to collapse this whole thing down to a single atom, then you have an atom that's 50% black, 50% yellow, all right? That's the average structure, and there's no difference, in the local structure. There's no particular difference from that, okay? Now take a look at this version of the alloy. It's the same number of atoms, 50% black atoms, 50% yellow, but now there's very clearly a preference for like atoms to cluster, yellow with yellow, black with black, okay? And so now the local structure actually is not completely random, all right? If you pick an atom, then you're most likely to find a like atom among its nearest neighbors, okay? So this is, again, another example of how the local structure is not equal to the average structure in this case, all right? And that could be important for understanding the properties of this alloy, okay? So that's what I'm talking about with local structure. How do we study the local structure? How do we study the structure of a material in general? There are a number of ways to do that, but one very common method is using scattering experiments, X-rays or neutrons or electrons. You shoot a beam of particles through your sample, you see how those particles scatter from your sample, you record those scattering events with some type of detector, and that scattering pattern gives you information about the structure. For example, if the material has long range order, if it's a well-ordered crystal, then the scattered beam gets concentrated into Bragg peaks, as we all know. So for example, if we calculate the diffraction pattern from this alloy, then we have very sharp Bragg peaks, and the periodicity and spacing of these Bragg peaks and intensities tell us about the structure of our alloy here. All right, now what if the material has short range order or local structure that deviates from the long range average structure? That results in diffuse scattering. Okay, long range order results in Bragg peaks. Short range order results in diffuse scattering, which shows up underneath and between the Bragg peaks. Okay, for example, if we calculate the scattering pattern from this alloy, if you're not looking carefully, you might just see Bragg peaks. Okay, but if you look carefully, you'll see that there's actually diffuse scattering underneath the Bragg peaks. So this blue curve here, this is the calculated scattering pattern from our alloy that has short range order, this tendency for like atoms to cluster together, compared to the red curve, or sorry, the red diffraction pattern here from this completely randomly ordered alloy. All right. And this diffuse scattering here contains the information about the short range correlations in this alloy. All right. So the diffuse scattering is very rich in information, but it can be hard to use. If we think about our typical structure refinement, Rietveld refinement, for example, diffuse scattering is usually just fitted to some polynomial background and subtracted out. Okay, it's usually ignored. But it's the diffuse scattering that contains that crucial information about the short range, the local structure. Okay, so how can we make use of this diffuse scattering to learn about those short range local structural correlations? One way to do that is with the PDF method. Okay, the pair distribution function method. And the basic idea is we use our total scattering pattern. So the Bragg scattering and the diffuse scattering, we don't throw any of it away. All right. And with that, we can extract both the average and local structure. And we do that once again by doing our scattering experiment. Typically, we do this on powder samples, okay, X-rays or neutrons. And we get our total scattering pattern, which has Bragg peaks, but may also have some diffuse features underneath those Bragg peaks, okay? And then we Fourier transform that scattering pattern to give us the real space pair distribution function, which we can then use for analysis or modeling or what have you. So the idea is to take our data and move it from momentum space, which is the most natural space to describe the scattering pattern, and transform it into real space, which is the most natural space to think about local structural correlations in a material. Okay, so that's the essence of the PDF method. But what exactly is the PDF? It's the Fourier transform of the normalized scattering pattern, but what does that actually mean? The PDF, you can think of it as essentially giving you the probability of finding two atoms separated by some real space distance r. Okay, so if we consider this graphene lattice, for example, and let's calculate the PDF corresponding to this graphene lattice. So you take an atom at the center and you look at all of its neighbors, and at each distance where you find a neighboring atom, you get a peak in your PDF. Okay, so notice this PDF pattern. This is real space distance in angstroms. So we're looking at the first 5 angstroms in this case. And so it gives us a map of the interatomic spacings in real space on these local, sub-nanometer length scales. Okay, so the PDF is really powerful because it gives us this information on the short range structure, but also there's nothing to prevent us from looking at the PDF out to longer length scales as well, several nanometers, for example, and then we can get the structural information on those longer length scales. And we can obtain it readily from experiment by doing this Fourier transform, and we can also calculate it from a given model of the structure. Basically, it consists of delta functions at atomic separation distances. Okay, you don't need to worry too much about the sequence. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Okay. Oh, by the way, I should have mentioned, I'm fine if you want to ask questions during or after. Either way is fine, but feel free to interrupt me if you do have a question. So I'm not sure if that was an intentional question or not. Anyway, so that is the PDF. And it's a great way to study the local structure of materials, in particular, when that local structure may differ in some meaningful way from the average structure, and that difference would be lost if you only looked at the Bragg peaks. Okay, so this is a way to make sure we don't lose the information contained in the diffuse scattering. Okay, with that background, let's jump into story number 1, nematic fluctuations in iron-based superconductors. So the iron-based superconductors have been around for about 15 years now. Perhaps they've already had their heyday in condensed matter physics, but they're still certainly a topic of general interest and lots of research going on. There are a number of material families that fit into the collection of iron-based superconductors. Here are a few of them shown on this slide. They all share this feature of having a square network of iron atoms, highlighted right here. Okay, so they share that structural similarity. They also tend to be antiferromagnetic, and most of them have a particular stripe type of antiferromagnetic order. And they're interesting, of course, because, well, for many reasons, but the reason that they first attracted interest is because they become superconducting. Some of them up to temperatures as high as 50 Kelvin. Now, that may not seem too impressive to you. 50 Kelvin superconductor doesn't necessarily sound like an earth-shattering breakthrough. Nevertheless, this transition temperature is too high to be explained by conventional BCS theory. So these are, in a sense, unconventional or high-temperature superconductors, perhaps similar to the more famous cuprate superconductors. And so these have been studied for a long time now. And of course, the big question is, what is the mechanism of superconductivity in these materials? And depending on who you ask, there may be different answers to this, but I think it's generally not settled yet. But it is clear that this interesting phase called the nematic phase, which shows up in all of these iron-based superconductors, is important to the superconductivity in some way. All right. And that's what we're going to be looking at and talking about for the next few minutes. So to understand the nematic phase of the iron-based superconductors, we can consider the structure. I mentioned that these iron-based superconductors all have a square network of iron atoms. So if here are our iron atoms forming a square. So of course we have this fourfold rotational symmetry of a square. This would be a tetragonal crystal structure. All right. Well, in the nematic phase, this fourfold rotational symmetry is lowered and our square gets stretched out into a rectangle. So now we just have twofold rotational symmetry. So we have broken that rotational symmetry, but we have not broken translational symmetry. We haven't changed the size of the unit cell. So translational symmetry is preserved, but this rotational symmetry from fourfold lowered down to twofold, that has been broken. That fourfold symmetry has been broken. Crystallographically, we would call this an orthorhombic structure rather than a tetragonal structure. So this is similar in a sense to, for example, the nematic phase in liquid crystals, where your long molecules can spontaneously choose a preferred direction that they line up in without breaking any translational symmetry. Okay, so this is where the word nematic originally, where that concept was originally applied to the structure of materials, to liquid crystals. Broken rotational symmetry with no loss of translational symmetry. So by analogy, this reduction of the fourfold rotational symmetry of our square lattice into the twofold rotational symmetry of this orthorhombic lattice, that can be considered an analog of this nematic phase in liquid crystals. So this is called an electronic nematic phase, and it shows up in the structure, okay, as a structural distortion, but it's a spontaneous symmetry breaking of the entire underlying system of electrons. It also shows up in the magnetism. Okay, so we get spin order, we get stripe type antiferromagnetism, and it also shows up in the orbital degree of freedom. Okay, as a preferential occupation of different orbitals. All right, so it's really this kind of general symmetry breaking that occurs in these materials. But we'll be focusing on the structural manifestation of the nematic phase, basically this distortion from a square into a rectangle. That's what I'll be focusing on. So the reason it's important is because optimal superconductivity in iron-based superconductors emerges out of the nematic phase. If we look at an electronic phase diagram here, for example, strontium, iron, arsenic doped with sodium, okay, as a function of sodium concentration and temperature here, we move through these various electronic and structural phases. Okay, so this phase right here, this is the nematic phase. It's antiferromagnetically ordered. It has that orthorhombic structural distortion. Okay, so we have this kind of rectangular structure with this spin order. Out here, this is a paramagnetic tetragonal phase. So this is non-nematic because the average structure is tetragonal. It maintains that square symmetry and there's no static magnetic order. Okay, as we introduce more sodium, then we access the superconducting state down here. Okay, and there's also this interesting pocket called the magnetic C4 phase, which we'll talk about in a moment. Jared Allred was very important for discovering and characterizing this magnetic C4 phase, as I'll mention. But the point is, this kind of optimal superconductivity, where the superconducting dome has its highest transition temperature, tends to appear right at the edge of this nematic phase. All right, so there seems to be some connection between the nematic phase and the superconductivity. Moreover, it was initially hypothesized and then demonstrated experimentally that there are nematic fluctuations present well outside of the static nematic phase. If we look at these red shaded regions, this is a schematic of where we might expect significant nematic fluctuations. So perhaps dynamically fluctuating regions of nematic order, short range nematic order in our material. Okay, and these nematic fluctuations extend out over the superconducting dome as well, once again suggesting that there's a connection between nematicity and the superconductivity. So we would, of course, like to observe these nematic fluctuations. If they exist and if they're important, then let's try to observe them and study them. And let's think about how we can study them. So these nematic fluctuations We know that they couple to a structural distortion, right? Because this nematic order shows up as a structural distortion. They're likely to be short-ranged, and we probably need kind of a detailed, fine temperature dependence to nail down, where these, at what temperature these fluctuations appear and so forth. So PDF is a great tool to study this, all right, because it gives us that sensitivity to short-range structural correlations, and we can collect data very rapidly at synchrotron sources or at the spallation neutron source, so we can collect data across a very fine temperature grid. So PDF is a great way to study this, all right? So we performed experiments at the SNS at Oak Ridge and NSLS2 at Brookhaven National Lab. As our model system, we examined this one, strontium, sodium, iron arsenide. This was very much a collaborative project. So I mentioned I did this mostly while I was a postdoc at UC Berkeley in the Bergenot group. We worked closely with the team at Argonne National Lab. Jared's picture is not up here. He moved on from this project just before I jumped onto the project. But anyway, he knows these people well. And then numerous other scientists also have been involved in this work. Let me just give you a sense for what the data look like. This is actually, I grabbed.
Hello, excuse me.
Oh yeah, please.
Yes, before you go further, I just want to clarify one thing about the nematic fluctuation.
Okay.
So a static nematic phase is basically the iron atoms arranging in a tetragonal orthorhombic.
Orthorhombic.
Orthorhombic. So the arrangement of iron atoms goes from square to a triangle. Is that
okay? So in the nematic phase, it's orthorhombic. So we have a rectangular lattice of the iron atoms.
Okay, so square to rectangle.
That's correct. Yep.
Okay, so nematic fluctuation is when the crystal spontaneously go between these two structures.
That's right.
So it's a fluctuation of morphological transition.
So you can think of it, again, this is mostly an electronic phase transition, and the structural phase transition is in some sense just a byproduct of that. But you can think of it as the electrons fluctuating between these two originally degenerate directions that they could choose for this nematic order, for choosing a special direction. They're fluctuating between different equivalent directions, fluctuating in time, perhaps in space as well. So those are the nematic fluctuations. And then as it goes across the phase boundary, then it locks into one of the directions that it's chosen. And now we have this static nematic order, which also shows up as static antiferromagnetic order, stripe type antiferromagnetism, and also orbital order as well.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you for the question.
Excuse me?
Oh, yes, go ahead.
Sir, actually, whatever I am able to look, that we have used the 4 elements of this alloy. So can we call it the medium entropy alloy?
This particular material right here?
Yes, sir.
I have never heard it referred to as a medium entropy alloy. This is a little bit of a different research space than that. And in the sense of, these medium or high entropy alloys stabilizing new crystal structures that are not present in the constituent parts of that alloy, components of the alloy, this doesn't have any of that type of behavior. So I don't know if there's a direct connection between like entropically stabilized structures and the one that we're looking at right now.
Okay, thank you, sir.
All right. Very good. So just to give you a sense for what the data look like, this is actually from a different iron-based superconductor, iron selenide. I accidentally grabbed the wrong slide. Anyway, the blue circles here represent the data. Okay, so again, these peaks show distances where pairs of atoms are separated. Okay, this is distance in angstroms on the horizontal axis. The red curve is the calculated PDF from a model, in this case from a model of the orthorhombic structure, okay? So you see it's quite a good fit. We're matching those peaks quite well. This is the fit residual down here. We compare that to a fit with a tetragonal model. And you can see that the tetragonal model, if you look at the fit residual down here, does noticeably worse than the orthorhombic model. And that's borne out in our goodness of fit metric, RW, 7.2% versus 10.2%. So this is an example of how we can take our PDF data, fit a structural model to it, and learn something. In this case, we've learned that at 90 Kelvin, the iron selenide data are better described, significantly better described by the orthorhombic model compared to the tetragonal model. And this is expected because iron selenide undergoes a nematic transition right around 90 Kelvin. Okay. But what we can do then is take our PDF data and we can actually choose a section of the data and perform a fit over that section of the data. For example, up to the first 25 angstroms or something like that. We choose this section of the data, we perform a fit to that section of the data, and we extract a best fit structural model. And then we can slide down through the data and define a new fitting window a little bit further out in real space distance and do another fit and then keep sliding down. And we can do a series of fits as we slide through the data from the low R local region to the longer R regions where we're probing longer length scale correlations. Okay, so with the PDF data, we can actually get a length scale dependent picture of the structure of the material. And if we do this at a bunch of different temperatures, 2 Kelvin, 10 Kelvin, and so forth, collect data at a whole bunch of different temperatures, then we can get a very detailed picture of the length scale dependence and the temperature dependence of the structure. And this is exactly what we need to be able to understand nematic fluctuations and when and where they appear and their length scale and all that. Okay, so this is the analysis method we're going to use to learn about these nematic fluctuations in iron-based superconductors. So let's first take a look at this particular compound, okay, with x equal to 0.28. All right, so if we draw a line on the electronic phase diagram, this is what we would expect. We'd expect a transition from tetragonal to orthorhombic right around 140 Kelvin. And in fact, if we take a look at the diffraction results, which probes the average structure because it's just looking at the Bragg peaks, then that's what we see. We see the A and B lattice parameters, they split around 130 or 140 Kelvin. And that's our transition, our nematic transition right there. Okay, now let's do the same thing looking at our PDF data. And if we perform fits over from 60 to 80 angstroms, all right, so we're looking at that length scale in our data and perform fits. And if we allow the lattice parameters to be different, then what we see is right around 140 Kelvin, there's a sharp transition where above this temperature, A and B naturally are equal to each other as they would be in the tetragonal state, but then below this temperature, they split, okay? Exactly like we're seeing with the average structure. So on the length scale of 60 to 80 angstroms, there's no real difference between the structure probed by PDF and then the average structure probed by Bragg peak analysis, okay, Rietveld refinement. But now let's do a fit over a shorter length scale, 5 to 25 angstroms. Now we see something quite different because at this transition temperature, 140 Kelvin, the lattice parameters are still different. We still have that rectangular symmetry breaking, okay, that orthorhombic structure where the lattice parameters are different, distinct from each other. So what we're seeing is on the length scale of 5 to 25 angstroms, we still have these short range orthorhombic or nematic correlations above the transition, okay? So this is direct evidence of these nematic fluctuations above the static nematic phase, because here we are in this temperature region and we still have this rectangular symmetry rather than the square symmetry, okay? And we have sensitivity to this because we're doing the Fourier transform of the Bragg peaks and also any diffuse scattering present, okay? So this is really cool because this tells us immediately that yes, there are nematic fluctuations present on this length scale, 5 to 25 angstroms, averaged out to 0 on this length scale right here. Okay, and in fact, we can go one step further if we choose two temperatures, 2 Kelvin and 170 Kelvin. So 2 Kelvin is deep in the nematic state, somewhere down here. Okay, then we do our fits, and this delta parameter, this is a measure of the orthorhombicity. It's the difference between A and B divided by their sum. And so if it's non-zero, that means you have an orthorhombic structure. Okay, and at 2 Kelvin, it remains orthorhombic across all length scales that we probed. Okay, the horizontal axis here shows the midpoint of our fitting range. So it tells us what length scale our fits are probing. Okay, at 170K up here, then we see that the orthorhombicity decreases significantly as we move out in real space and then goes to 0 eventually. Okay, so this gives us an idea of the length scale of these nematic correlations in this particular compound. All right, so naturally we are interested in seeing where these correlations are present. And in particular, if we choose a composition that goes through this magnetic C4 phase, we can learn something quite interesting as well. I'm just checking the time here. I'm going to move forward just a little more rapidly, I think. This green phase, the magnetic C4 phase is what it's called. It's interesting and unusual, and it was completely unexpected when it was first discovered, because what happens is as you lower the temperature, your material transitions from tetragonal symmetry, that's the square symmetry, to the rectangular symmetry. But then as you keep lowering the temperature, this square symmetry reappears. It's a reentrant C4 phase, C4 referring to this fourfold rotational symmetry of the square. So if you look at the diffraction pattern, you have a splitting of the Bragg peak at the initial transition right here, and then the Bragg peak reconverges below as it enters this reentrant C4 phase. And Jared Allred did some very nice work to determine what's happening to the magnetism in this magnetic C4 phase, and he showed that it is magnetically ordered. It's an interesting coherent superposition of two orthogonal spin density waves, and that has some important implications for how we understand the significance of this magnetic C4 phase. And it turns out that it actually shows up in a bunch of different hole doped iron nictide materials. So this is actually an important phase that needs to be understood to get a proper understanding of these iron-based superconductors. Anyway, our question was, the average structure shows this return to fourfold rotational symmetry. What happens in the local structure? So using PDF, we can answer that question. So we'll do the same type of analysis. As a reminder, here's the average structure probed from Rietveld refinement of the diffraction patterns. And if we look at our PDF data over long length scales, 60 to 80 angstroms, then we see the same thing. There is a small temperature window where A and B are split from each other. That would be in this region. But then as we lower the temperature further, A and B reconverge and we re-enter this tetragonal phase. Now, let's look at local length scales again. And what we find is that at all temperatures, the structure is actually orthorhombic, including in this low temperature reentrant C4 phase. Okay, so this is important because it means that these nematic fluctuations are also present in this magnetic C4 phase. So if you think about the electrons in the system, sensing their immediate surroundings are symmetry broken. Their immediate surroundings already have this orthorhombic distortion. And that's not a long range distortion, because as we go out over longer length scales, it averages out to 0 and we recover that tetragonal symmetry. But in the immediate local surroundings, that orthorhombic distortion, that nematic distortion, is still present. Okay, so we have strong nematic fluctuations even in the C4 phase. So this was interesting and surprising to see that even deep into the C4 phase, the nematic fluctuations are preserved. this is an interesting way to display the data. This is showing length scale on the horizontal axis and temperature on the vertical axis, and the brightness tells us how distorted the structure is, how orthorhombic the structure is. Okay, in other words, how strong is this nematic distortion? And so if we look at just under 100 Kelvin, that is the initial transition from the tetragonal state into the orthorhombic state. And then around 75 Kelvin, we transition back into the reentrant C4 state. Okay. But if we look at the low R region, at the local structure, it's actually orthorhombic at all temperatures. Okay. When we go out to higher length scales, now we see the clear transition from tetragonal to orthorhombic to back to tetragonal. But at lower length scales, it's actually tetragonal at all, or sorry, orthorhombic at all temperatures. So this is a useful way to see at a glance what is happening, where these short range nematic fluctuations are present. And we can actually do that for a bunch of different compounds across this electronic phase diagram. And we see that nematic fluctuations are present ubiquitously. Every compound that we studied had some region of short range nematic correlations corresponding to these nematic fluctuations, including this compound right here, the 48% sodium compound, which is completely outside this orthorhombic dome and is close to this optimal superconducting region. And so even in that portion of the phase diagram, we have significant nematic fluctuations. So what that means is this was the phase diagram we started with originally, but this is only showing the average structure. This phase diagram is not accurately representing the local structure. So we should update this phase diagram to show this very large region in temperature and composition space where we have significant short range nematic correlations. And this would be the region of nematic fluctuations, which had been predicted and kind of indirectly observed through various other probes. But here with PDF, we can actually directly observe these short range orthorhombic distortions. And so this is important because it tells us that these fluctuations are present across the phase diagram, reaching out to where superconductivity has its optimal TC. And so, when we consider the mechanism of superconductivity in iron-based superconductors, we should remember that these nematic fluctuations are certainly present and play an important role in the way the electrons live in these iron-based superconductors. So that wraps up story number one. And I'm just looking at the time. I think I'm going to basically skip story number two. What time are we supposed to end, by the way?
I mean, so usually we'd like to start questions around 10:50. You did take a few, so you could probably push to 10:50. That's our time. Yeah, 55 if you wanted, but we would want to give a couple minutes for questions.
Yeah,
so maybe,
absolutely. Yeah. Let me give just the overview version of story number two, which is about manganese telluride, which is an old material. It's been known for a long time. It's an antiferromagnetic semiconductor. But recently it has become of interest again because it is a good candidate as a high performance thermoelectric material and also a platform for spintronics. So in the last 5 years or so, there's been a renewal of interest in manganese telluride. The aspect of manganese telluride that is relevant for this discussion is its thermoelectric properties. One way to quantify how good a thermoelectric is with this dimensionless figure of merit, ZT, described by this combination of material parameters, the Seebeck coefficient, temperature, resistivity, and thermal conductivity. And basically, if you have ZT close to 1 or greater, then you have an efficient thermoelectric device, which could be useful for technological applications. So that's the challenge. Find or design a material with a large value of ZT in a useful temperature range. But that's tough to do because a lot of these parameters are, they move in counter to each other. So if you, for example, if you decrease the resistivity, you are probably increasing the thermal conductivity. So it's hard to make a net gain in your ZT. All right. So manganese telluride, somehow, when you dope it with just a little bit of sodium or lithium, you can get a ZT which is on its way up towards 1. All right. So that's promising. How does it do this? The answer is in the magnetism. Okay, I mentioned this as an antiferromagnetic semiconductor. Recently, it was shown that there is an interesting new phenomenon called paramagnon drag, where short-range magnetic correlations in manganese telluride interact with electrons in such a way that the electrons get essentially dragged across the material with a thermal flux of paramagnons, which are excitations of these short-range magnetic domains, if you will, above the ordering temperature in manganese telluride. Okay, so if you use inelastic neutron scattering to look at the magnetic excitations, you can see that there are significant magnetic excitations at 360 Kelvin. I should mention the long-range magnetic transition occurs at 307 Kelvin in manganese telluride. So this is kind of probing short-range correlated regions, antiferromagnetic regions in manganese telluride above the transition temperature. And it was demonstrated that these short-range correlations can interact with the electrons in such a way to give a boost to the thermo power. And that allows manganese telluride to become a candidate high-performance thermoelectric material. So it's these short-range magnetic correlations which are crucial for understanding how manganese telluride gets its thermoelectric properties. So if we want to study a short-range structure, in this case, short-range magnetic structure, then PDF is a great option. And in this case, we will use magnetic PDF. All right. So just like atomic PDF, which is what I've been discussing up until this point, you get it as the Fourier transform of diffuse scattering from atoms and nuclei. If instead you take the diffuse scattering from magnetic moments, right? Neutrons scatter from the magnetic moments in a material. And that diffuse scattering, if you Fourier transform it, will give you the magnetic PDF. So it's analogous to the atomic PDF, but it just comes from the magnetic scattering. All right. I'll skip through this. And I'll just mention that you can also do PDF on single crystals of materials. Up until now, I've been talking about powder samples, but you can do a single crystal experiment and get a 3-dimensional PDF pattern. This is an example of a 3-dimensional magnetic PDF pattern. So this is the diffuse magnetic scattering. Then you do the 3-dimensional Fourier transform and you get the 3-dimensional magnetic PDF, where these spots, blue and red spots, correspond to anti-alignment, those are the blue spots, or parallel alignment between pairs of spins separated by these real space vectors that we see in our 3-dimensional PDF pattern. Okay, so I'll just jump right to the punchline, which is when we do a 3D magnetic PDF experiment on manganese telluride, we get a picture of the short-range magnetic correlations that give rise to this paramagnon drag effect and enhance the thermoelectric figure of merit in manganese telluride. So I'm showing you right here the 3-dimensional magnetic PDF pattern at 330 Kelvin, which is above the magnetic ordering temperature in manganese telluride. And we have these alternating bright and dark spots. So these dark spots, this is anti-ferromagnetic alignment, and then the bright spots show ferromagnetic alignment or parallel alignment. And so you can see that there's a pattern of alternating bright and dark spots as we go up and down in the Z direction through the crystal. But as we go left and right along the X direction in the crystal, then it's actually all one color. So we have alignment within these planes and anti-ferromagnetic alternation perpendicular to that. Okay, so this is really amazing because this shows us at a glance what the short-range local magnetic structure looks like in manganese telluride above the ordering temperature. All right, so we immediately see that, yes, we do have these short-range magnetic correlations. They have this antiferromagnetic arrangement, and we can get some quantitative information as well. Oh, by the way, this is a view of the 3D magnetic PDF in the plane of the crystal, the XY or the AB plane of the crystal. We only have bright spots because it's aligned ferromagnetically within planes. Okay, so by taking a couple of slices through our three-dimensional magnetic PDF data, we can get a really good picture of what these short-range magnetic correlations look like. And we can do some analysis. We can take some slices, some cuts through the data here, and we can fit correlation length envelopes to them. So we can learn all about the properties of these short-range magnetic correlations and figure out what the correlation length is. Turns out the correlation length is longer along the C axis than it is within the AB plane. And you can see that just by looking. You can see that the correlations are more well-defined in this vertical direction than in the horizontal direction. And that's borne out as well by fits to the data here. So we can gain a lot of information about the short-range magnetic correlations in manganese telluride through this magnetic PDF technique. In this case, three-dimensional magnetic PDF from a single crystal of manganese telluride. So let me, again, it's some other interesting information we can extract. I'll skip all that. I'll mention that there's some very nice theoretical work done as well by a collaborator of ours, and we're able to reproduce these results from ab initio DFT results, basically, with very high level of accuracy. But the key point is, using magnetic PDF techniques, we've been able to obtain a real space picture of these short-range antiferromagnetic correlations in manganese telluride, which are responsible for the promising thermoelectric properties of manganese telluride. So once again, it's the short-range local correlations which are important for the global properties of interest. All right, and that's kind of the concluding thought that I want to share with you. Short-range atomic and magnetic correlations are important, in many cases absolutely crucial for the global properties that we observe in many different materials of fundamental and applied interest. And PDF methods are excellent tools for probing these features on the local structure. So I'm open for collaborations. If you have a project where you want to investigate local structure with PDF, please feel free to reach out. I have a lot of fun doing these types of experiments and analysis, and I'm amazed that we can gain such deep insight to the structure of these materials on these tiny length scales and think about how that affects the global properties that we observe. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have.